This is a story about a tragic labor event that happened in 1937. My name is Chris Wally. My grandfather was an iron worker in southeast Chicago. He was one of the many sympathy strikers who was there when the Memorial Day Massacre happened. Sit back and follow this story like you're watching a documentary film. This is a journey into the history of the Memorial Day Massacre, created from the voices and donated objects of southeast Chicago residents. Geraldine Jolly Borazon made this scrapbook in 1937 when she was 19 years old. Most scrapbooks mark weddings, graduations, and other life events. Jerry's album commemorates a massacre. This is Mike Borazon. Mike said, "My mom kept a good book. All my family was here, my mom, my dad, my uncles, because they wanted to form a union. Back in them days, they had no rights as workers." And here, if you click here, Mike takes you to the site where the Memorial Day Massacre happened and tells you a little bit about it.
Yeah, my mom kept a good book. Sad day, sad day. This is where I grew up as a kid. It's on 117th and Buffalo. This dirt road still looks the same as it did when I was growing up here. I had a pear tree right here. And the steel mill was right there. When we lived here, my dad would walk to work. There used to be a brick factory over there. But I guess when the 1937 strike hit, this was all prairie, except for the few houses that were here. And from I remember from that day is what my mom and dad told me. They were pickling the steel mill. All my family was here. My mom, my dad, my uncles, they were all here because they wanted to form the union. And back in them days, you know, they had no rights as workers. And then as my dad would say, the bulls come running down the hill with their nightsticks, shooting people, beating people. And they say it got pretty violent. They seen many of their friends getting hit with the billy clubs, seen a couple of the people that died falling next to them. That was 1937, Memorial Day. Yeah, all this happened right in here.
Jerry and her brothers grew up in a house next door to the Republic Steel plant in southeast Chicago. By the time she was 19 years old in 1937, her older brother Jim and her fiancé Steve were both working in the mill just down the road. They were among a growing number of workers who wanted a union. On a sunny afternoon on Memorial Day, one of the most tragic events in U.S. labor history would unfold just outside Jerry's door. That day, striking workers and supporters rallied near the plant to support the right to unionize and picket. Jerry was among them.
They would all march through that big prairie. I lived in the second house right from where we were standing in that prairie.
And if you're watching this on the website, you can go to the upper left-hand corner and click on these pink boxes, and it'll take you to the oral history with Jerry speaking or any of the other objects that you're going to see. As the strikers approached the plant gates, police opened fire. 10 strikers were killed and nearly 100 wounded. The event would be remembered as the Memorial Day Massacre. And here's photos that were taken at the time. This is the next chapter before the massacre. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, life was hard for steelworkers at Republic and other Southeast Chicago mills. Foremen decided who got work and who didn't. Many worked only a few days a month, and they were lucky to get that.
In them days, they shoveled coal. They each take their turns. As they get in a group, they each take their turns shoveling into the furnace, which is terribly hot. And they just wanted better wages for this terrible labor that they did at the furnaces.
In the steel industry, the early 19th century unions had mostly been eliminated by the 1920s. Many steelworkers had almost given up on union organizing. George Patterson was a local steelworker and Sunday school superintendent who later became a labor organizer.
I myself was born in Scotland and knew about labor movements and was shocked at the Americans' lack of knowledge.
But the Depression meant that many workers, like Jerry's fiancé Steve Borzon, had little left to lose. Steve said, "I was young. I was 21 years old. I wasn't afraid of anything because working in the plant at that time, even if they fired you, you weren't losing anything. It was terrible." Then in 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the Wagner Act, giving workers the right to unionize.
There was an enormous advance, of course. First of all, you had the right to organize, that you were being punished, you weren't being killed for it, you weren't being jailed. You had the right, it was the law. And that was absolutely revolutionary in our country.
After the Wagner Act, steelworkers in the Calumet region began organizing their own independent unions. At the time, George Patterson was a roll turner at Southworks Mill of the Carnegie, Illinois U.S. Steel Mill. George said from the time, "We voted to form an independent group at Southworks. This meeting that we called to organize the associated employees was held at the night that Joe Louis won the world championship. In fact, I recall our meeting was adjourned in order to catch the fight, which started at 9:30. But about 800 workers showed up at Bessemer Park, and we started holding regular meetings. I was elected president." But organizing was still difficult. For decades, steel companies had used armed guards and paid company spies to infiltrate unions and deter organizing. George Patterson had himself been offered $75 a month to become a stool pigeon, quote unquote, and to spy on fellow unionists. Pro-union workers were constantly looking over their shoulders, but the Wagner Act inspired them.
We took it for granted that spies. The stool pigeon, my general statement was, "Remember tonight, gentlemen, you who are here, know that amongst us there are a couple of stool pigeons."
The movement was spreading like wildfire. Tens of thousands signed up to join the unionizing drives of the newly formed Congress of Industrial Workers, or CIO, and its Steel Workers Organizing Committee, known as SWOC, led by veteran labor leaders John Lewis and Phil Murray. Patterson's group at U.S. Steel Southworks, later called Local 65, was the first steel union group in the country to join the CIO. Steel companies often pitted ethnic and racial groups against each other to discourage workers from banding together. Now the CIO was attempting to organize across those lines. And here, if you're on the website version, you can click and find out more information about some of the early organizers of Local 65. Less than a year after SWOC was formed, U.S. Steel, the largest of all steel companies, shook up the steel industry by deciding to officially recognize the CIO. However, the smaller steel companies, including Republic, collectively known as Little Steel, refused. Tom Girdler, who led Republic Steel, was known for being virulently anti-union. Girdler famously said that he'd rather quit steel and go back to his farm and pick apples and potatoes than recognize the CIO.
A man named Tom Girdler was the epitome of all the viciousness that was visited on the workers. He wasn't going to give in.
Workers were determined to force the little steel companies, including Republic, to recognize the new union. In May 1937, union leaders called for a strike. The Little Steel strike involved tens of thousands of steelworkers and their supporters across the Midwest. It was one of the most important labor events in U.S. history. In Southeast Chicago, union organizers claimed that nearly 3/4 of Republic workers supported the strike. Some employees, however, wanted to keep working. A few were being paid by the company to undermine union organizing. Union supporters called them scabs and finks. Some in the community, including many business and church leaders, also didn't support the strikers.
The clergy were not behind us. The Catholic Church was definitely not behind us.
Other steelworkers and neighbors, however, supported the strikers. The workers set up a strike headquarters at Sam's Place, an abandoned tavern a few blocks from the mill, where union supporters would gather. I myself know about Sam's Place because my grandfather used to take my dad, who was 5 years old at the time and was later a steelworker himself. He used to take him to some of these meetings. Many women were among them. While few women were laborers in the steel mills, many relatives of workers were active in union efforts. Jerry helped the Women's Auxiliary run a soup kitchen at Sam's Place. And again, if you go to the online version, if you want to click and find out more about the Women's Auxiliary, you can. In defiance of the Wagner Act, Girdler and Republic made preparations to break the strike.
Prior to the start of the strike, the company had stockpiled food supplies, cots, and other equipment to maintain a workforce inside the plant.
It was later discovered that Republic and other little steel companies also stockpile arms and ammunition in plants across the Midwest. Between 1933 and 1937, Republic Steel was the largest purchaser of tear gas in the entire country. And again, on the online version, if you go to the upper left-hand corner, you can click on items that people have donated, including seeing some of the receipts that were just mentioned. In Chicago, Republic Steel provided tear gas, non-regulation batons, and a temporary headquarters to city police. The police force assigned to the Republic strike was led by Captain Mooney.
And Mooney and these guys are swinging their own deal with the steel company. It's not unusual at that time, for many of the Chicago policemen to make their own deals with the companies when there was a strike problem. And if you're any student of Chicago labor history, you know of one of the former head of the labor detail who retired a millionaire.
Even though President Roosevelt and Chicago's Mayor Kelly recognized workers' right to peacefully picket, Republic's President Girdler and the Chicago police force were opposed to the strikers. They claimed the strikers and their sympathizers were Bolsheviks and Reds planning a violent takeover of the mill. And here's a quote from Tom Girdler, the head of Republic Steel. "Must Republic and its men submit to the communistic dictates and terrorism of the CIO? If America is to remain a free country, the answer is no." Although only a small number of strikers among tens of thousands were communist, companies used the claim to portray them as violent and to turn public opinion against SWAC.
That's what they figured they had, that everybody that was on the line there, everybody's marching was a commie. There was a lot of good Catholics and everything else was in that. Protestants and Presbyterians, were they all commies? That was their idea. To provoke communism, that everybody was a commie.
And for more information on this, you can click on these extra boxes. In the first days of the strike, efforts to legally picket were met with violence by police under the influence of Republic Steel. This is a page from Jerry's scrapbook. Up here in Jerry's scrapbook, you can see Steve written here. This is her husband, Steve Borazon. Here's a quote from Steve. "The strike was called on May 26th, and we tried to picket that night, but the police busted it up. Some of the guys were scared they were going to lose their jobs, and they were running into the plant. And other guys who were in there were having a hard time getting out. The company, only allowed us 7 pickets." By this point, George Patterson had been fired from Southworks for union activity. He had instead become a full-time SWACA organizer and had helped Republic workers to organize Local 1033.
This is our first big strike in this region. Most of us were inexperienced. All we knew was that we're supposed to, according to theory, be able to march back and forth but have a picket line. Suddenly the police begin whacking at you with their clubs. And there's a lot of women in the crowd. There were a lot of wives come down there to see their husband coming out of the plant. They began to get hit and the men began to get angry. We all sat down and said, "We're not going any further." The cop said, "You're going in the wagon," and began throwing us into the wagon.
After several days of being beaten and prevented from picketing, strikers called for a mass rally on Memorial Day, 1937. The next chapter is called The Massacre. And just to let people know, there are video images that contain violence, just so you're aware. May 30th, 1937. The rally would take place in the field next to Sam's place, just outside the Republic Steel gates. Large numbers turned out for the rally. Neighbors and family members arrived along with supporters from other parts of Chicago. Strikers from the little steel mills across the Indiana border also came in a show of solidarity.
That was a gorgeous day. It was beautiful. It was warm. And there were thousands of people there.
They would all march through that big prairie. I lived in the second house right from where we were standing in that prairie.
I watched the Paramount newsreel fellows set up their newsreel cameras on the truck, and I listened to some of the police talking to themselves, saying, "Let those bastards come down here, we'll take care of them when they come down."
There was right up there in front, as we marched through the prairie. It was a peaceful march, but we were stopped by a line of police officers just stretched across from one side of the road to the other.
I walked right between the lines. You could see how nervous I am. I'm biting my lips as I go along, you know.
And here you can click on these pullouts to find out more information, also including about quotes from Captain Moody from testimony that was taken later.
And I see the guys falling like wheat to my right. And those were the ones that got killed. They got shot.
I looked around and I really, for the first time in my life, saw a battlefield, because that's what it looked like. It was a battlefield.
Everybody started running back, and everybody was frightened, but I ran right home because I lived right there.
People were just dragging bodies towards Sam's place. There was a policeman pointing a gun in my back and saying, "Get off the field or I'll put a bullet through your back." It was just a horrendous, absolutely horrendous sight. There was one father who carried his kid, and one of the bullets hit the child's foot and shot off the heel of his foot.
And again, you can find out more information. This is from later testimony from one of the women who was there, Mrs. Lupe Marshall Gallardo. She said, "A patrol wagon drove in, and it stopped right in front of us. I had one foot on the step when a policeman put his hand on my back, on my buttocks, and shoved me in there. I started helping these men who were in the wagon, and I noticed that there was one particular fellow there who looked very gaunt and haggard, and he seemed to be in a terrible position. There was a heavy-set man that had fallen on top of him, and this fellow was pinned completely, with his head over his knees. I straightened him out, managed to get his head on my lap, but when I did that I noticed that his face was getting cold and was turning black, and he was motioning to his shirt pocket. He had a package of cigarettes in there, and I understood he wanted me to light a cigarette for him, and when I did get the cigarette out, it was cloaked with blood. So he said, 'Never mind, kid,' he says, 'you're all right.' And he started to say mother but didn't finish, and he stiffened up, and I became somewhat hysterical. I told the policeman that was in the back of the wagon. I said, 'Your children and wife must be very proud of you.' And he says, 'I didn't do that.' And he says, 'I wouldn't do that.' And as he said that, I noticed the tears rolling down his eyes. There's more information on Lupe Gallardo and the Mexican Popular Front. After the massacre, 4 people died on the field that day. 6 more would later die from their injuries. Nearly 100 people were wounded, 30 by gunshots. And if you go to the website, you can also look at the death certificates from those who were killed. You can also find out more information about various people who died. Thousands attended the funerals of those killed. Members of Local 65 filmed the events. Some Chicago newspapers, known for anti-union views, printed stories that blamed the crowd for rioting. They wrote that the crowd had attacked and the police had fired in self-defense. Some police officers claimed to the press or in affidavits that the strikers carried guns and other weapons, or that they were like wild men on drugs. At first, such claims shifted popular opinion against the picketers, but as other accounts leaked out, they suggested something very different. Interviewer: was there any indication, though, that you would reoccupy any portion of the plant? George Patterson responded, "Oh no, that's all nonsense. That's entirely a fabrication of the media, as they say today. No one had any intent on ever going inside the plant. All we wanted was a picket line outside of the plant. Police knew it. Everyone knew all we wanted was a picket line. But there was always that communist thing in the air. In quotes, the communists were going to take over the plant." Interviewer: from all indications you have, there were no weapons. George Patterson: no weapons, nothing. The only weapon that a worker had was a picket sign. As we walked, you could at least stick in the picket sign. If we picked up a rock or something on the way, it was a prairie, you could pick up a rock. I myself picked up a rock at one time and put it back down because I got so damned angry. You couldn't help but get angry when you saw what the police were doing. I found out the hopelessness of even trying to hit a policeman. They were too far away. They were using their guns. Meetings to support the workers were held at the Civic Opera House in Chicago Coliseum. Demands were made that Congress investigate and determine what really happened. The U.S. Senate's La Follette Commission launched an investigation. Dozens of strikers, police, and bystanders were called to Washington to testify. And here you can find more information on the La Follette Commission and on one of the people who were injured, Harry Harper. Senate La Follette: I understand it to be your best judgment that the shooting that was done by the police was being done by policemen who were knocked on the ground? Captain Mooney responded, defending their lives, yes, sir. Senator La Follette: these autopsy reports show that 7 of these men died from a wound in the back and the other 3 from side wounds. Will you please give me your explanation of the fact that these men died from back wounds if the police only shot in self-defense and from the ground? Captain Mooney: if I'm shooting from the ground and there are 8 or 10 of them Reds over me and I had a pistol, I would not say whether they would get shot in the back or the front. Senator La Follette: it would seem to me that if a man was on the ground and I was surrounded by these people who were attacking me with clubs and so on, that those people would be facing me. Captain Mooney responds, of course there's a possibility of those other fellows, the strikers, that were over them, the police, with their clubs, rocks, and other things that they had. They might have turned their back when the policeman pulled his pistol and they might have been shot. Laughter in the hearing room. Lupe Marshall Galato, George Patterson, and many others were among them. Jerry's younger brother George testified that the so-called weapons police came strikers carried was really just garbage strewn on the field. And here you have a series of images from the massacre. The newsreel film contradicted the police and supported strikers' accounts. Paramount at first refused to release the footage, fearing it would cause a riot, but the investigation subpoenaed it. The riot would go down in history books as a massacre. No industry officials or police, however, were ever charged with the crime. Although the strike was broken nationally, hundreds of Republic workers in Chicago held out on strike for years. In 1941, 4 years after the massacre, Republic was finally forced to recognize the Union, rehire strikers, and pay back pay. A few months later, Jerry and Steve got married on the back pay. After World War II, they raised their family at a time when unions were a valued part of American life. Steelworkers and their families were now firmly middle class. Remembering the Massacre. The Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 would nationally be remembered for its significance for American workers. Within Southeast Chicago, unions and residents continue to remember the struggle and those who died.
My home is over Jordan. Deep river, I want to cross over to campground. My home is over Jordan. Deep river, I want to cross over to campground.
After Southeast Chicago steel mills closed in the 1980s and 90s, the Republic Steel site became a vacant brownfield. Despite the loss of the steel industry, the commemorations continue. And here's video of Jerry Borazon talking about the scrapbook at one of the commemorations in 1999.
We were in it. Our whole crowd here, we were all in it.
And she played hooky for school those days.
Yeah, but my husband Steve, we were only sweethearts at the time.
Oh, yeah?
Steve and I were. But later on, we got married on his back wages.
Oh, okay.
On his back pay.
So now what's your name now?
Well, my maiden name was Jolly, but now it's Borazon. Steve Borazon's wife.
Steve Borazon, okay.
Thank you.
Jerry donated her scrapbook to the museum in 2002. She passed away 12 years later at 96. Her scrapbook, however, helps us remember. Her son Mike says, "Thanks guys for getting things going for us. They need the unions."
I remember some of the names in here. Tony Taylor was killed. Must be Marty Egan, my dad's good friend. Yeah, there's my dad. Sam Popovich. And my dad knew a lot of people, so he might have known them all. He was instrumental in trying to get the unions going too. Well, thanks guys for getting things going for us. I'm glad they erected this for them.
And that's the end of the Memorial Day Massacre storyline. Thank you for joining us for it. We have 3 other interactive documentaries and videos. One called Mexican American Journeys, one about the environment called From Wetlands to Waste, and one about the closing of the steel mills and the impact that that had on people in the Calumet region. Thank you.